don't feel like it's gonna be a bad day.
Oh, what's good, everyone? Welcome inside the Bucks Film Room podcast. My name is Brian Sampson. You can find me on Twitter at Bucks Film Room. I write about the Milwaukee Bucks for Forbes Sports. And today, very special guest. Really, he's coming in here for the first time. I'm excited to hear the insight that he has to say and what he has to share with us. Jim Owczarski from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Jim, did I say the name correctly? I've been practicing it all day long. I'm not going to lie.
You did. It was fantastic. Thanks for having me.
I Googled it. I was researching it. I was listening to it. I'm like, I cannot mess this up. There's a lot of consonants in that name. I'm like, all right, got to get it right. Got to respect him,
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So, Jim, we were just talking about this off air before we came on. Jim, you came on in 2020 and have been covering the Bucks for 4 years now? What has been kind of your favorite story or kind of favorite storyline to watch with the Bucks since your most recent tenure?
I mean, yeah, well, obviously to start and the team wins a championship in that first season. That's the first title I've covered, from start to finish, I should say, and that was pretty incredible. But I'll say, I'm going to trigger some Bucks fans here a little bit. I think what's been the most interesting has been to start with press conferences, or at the time Zoom conferences, about, is Giannis going to sign the Supermax in that winter of 20? Like literally my first day on the beat coming over from the Packers was that, to this fall, sort of the surprise extension. And not that that's a daily storyline, Brian, but like it's a thing. It on the national level, it gets talked about on a regular basis. You kind of hear about it here or there. That's probably the weirdest thing, especially coming from an NFL baseball background. Like that stuff just doesn't happen in those sports. So that's been strange, but clearly the favorite thing has been, covering a championship team. And then also the fact that they've sort of been in that mix every year since, Brian. Yeah, they've fallen short, but that's a unique thing in pro sports. The Bucks are in a window, and I don't take that for granted in terms of just the quality of basketball I get to see every day.
Yeah, it's really a big change from the Herb Cole era, where really just fighting for the AC to the playoffs every single year. If you win a playoff game, maybe two, that's probably considered a successful year. Now it's championship or bust every single season. And that's really what Jim and I want to get into here today. Is there's 8 games left in the season. Bucks are in second place in the East. As of today, we're recording this on Sunday night. Both the Knicks lost and the Cavs lost on Sunday. So that means the Bucks are up 2.5 games on Cleveland and up 3 on New York with 8 to play. And Milwaukee still has a fairly challenging schedule ahead of them. They're in the middle of a kind of a road trip right now. They play the Magic a couple of times. I forget who else they play, but they still have some pretty tough teams here to play. So some work to be done. Damian Lillard, Jim, you had asked a good question at their media scrum a couple of days ago as far as Lillard. He was out on Saturday night's game, and it sounds like he's going to miss the game against the Wizards as well due to personal reasons. Was that your takeaway as well?
Yeah, Doc Rivers was non-committal. He said there's a chance, he misses this game. They're off, excuse me, today as we record this. They're going to have an off day in DC on Monday. So we'll learn his status late Monday afternoon when that first injury report has to be out. But yeah, the fact that Doc said there's a chance he misses it, obviously we'll just have to see kind of where that goes.
Yeah. So a lot of questions here, and the Bucks, they've been flirting with, do they have momentum? Are they losing momentum? They've kind of been back and forth with that. So what I'd asked Jim to come prepared to talk with today was X factors for the playoffs. Really, that's what it's about, right? Is it doesn't really matter how the Bucks do or don't do here in the regular season. It's all about how they perform in the postseason, where last year they lost to the Miami Heat, and they could actually end up seeing Miami again. That's a very realistic possibility this time around, with Miami holding down one of those final play-in spots. And if the playoffs were to begin today, it'd be Miami versus Philadelphia in that first play-in game, with the winner then taking on the Bucks. So what we wanted to talk about was that postseason as far as X factors, and as far as what do the Bucks need, or who do the Bucks need to step up to make a deep postseason run? Who are those guys that really need to rise to the occasion and be ready to play, to be those X factors to help Milwaukee, go from a first round playoff exit, really is kind of their baseline this year, to obtaining the ultimate goal. So Jim, I want to start with you. Who is your first X factor that the Bucks really need to look for as far as somebody who can help them meet their ultimate goal this season?
Yeah, so the way I approach this, Brian, and for the listeners was, for me, the core four, the big three, right? They got to be healthy. They've got to be good. So I looked at this, and this is the curse of every Bucks team. Until they win another one, they're going to be compared to 2021, right? And so I looked at how that team won a championship, and sort of determining this. And the first guy that popped to mind is the fifth starter, the fifth option, if you will, in Malik Beasley. Obviously having a career year on the offensive end. I think he would say he's having a career year on the defensive end. And Brian, the reason I say he's the X factor to me is he's a starter, first of all, but not really thought of, I guess, when these discussions happen. And, Doc Rivers has said Malik is a barometer for the offense, meaning, yes, they're talented enough with the big three that they can play a lot of heavy ISO. The ball can stick. They're talented enough to run 2-man game all game long and get good looks. 3-man game now with Chris. But, at some point, teams are going to stop that, as we have seen. And if Malik has 0 shots or 1 shot, he's like, that's the barometer for how that ball is moving. Is there pace in the half court? And so that's one part of the X factor to me, Brian, is it's the overall health of the offense. It's not him scoring 15 points. It's just, is he getting shots? Is he getting open looks? So that's one. Now to Malik as a statistical contributor, everyone remembers Bryn Forbes outscored Jimmy buckets in the first round of the playoffs, right? And look, to me, Bryn, he was a bench player, but you're going to need, if you're going to win 4 series, you're going to need someone to have that series for you. That's not one of your core guys. Dame's going to have bad shooting nights. Same with Chris. Giannis may miss 11 free throws again in a game. You're going to need someone to have a big series to hit those shots. And to me, that's Malik Beasley. Beasley has shown he can get on a heater. He set the franchise record, Brian, in most games in a year with 5 or more threes. You can tell when that's going in with him. And even on some of these, where he's maybe missed his first few, if he's getting some shots, he's not, he doesn't lose confidence in that. So that's why I'm going to go with Malik Beasley as sort of my X factor there. And there's obviously the defensive element, but we're thinking offense. And I think those two factors, that sort of the health of the whole group, and then also you're going to need a guy like that to play really well in at least one series, if not 2, to win a championship.
Yeah, I like what you said of the health of the offense. That really stuck with me, as far as he's not a guy who's going to create his own shot, right? Especially if the offense is working as it should. He's more of a guy who's going to be the symptom of a good offense, where the ball movement's going to be there, or the shot creation from Giannis, from Lillard, from Middleton is going to be there, where then rotations are going to happen from the defense, and he's going to be left open in the corner or elsewhere. So I really like that, as far as, is he going to be open, because are the Bucks going to be running their offense or sharing the ball like they should? But then the second part is he going to knock down those looks, right? Like, we've seen him kind of come and go. Mostly, like, for most of the season, he's been hot. He's struggled here a little bit in the past month or so, but like, what will that look like for him? Defense. Well, I guess before I go to defensive end, because I know you were focused on offensive end, my question is, if the Bucks are functioning as they should, do you think Beasley's part of their closing five? Like, we know he's their starting five, but more importantly is that group that's going to end. Do you see him playing that role in their closing five for games in the postseason?
Man, that's a great question. And I wonder if even Doc knows that answer, because they just haven't, as soon as Chris was healthy, Giannis missed games, and now Dame's missing games. There's a part of me that thinks his buy-in, and look, he's still a bigger body. I do think it depends on the matchup, though. I could see, man, we'd have to really break down who those backcourts could be. I think Jay's too big up there, Brian. I don't know if Jay's the best option if outside of Boston, and I know maybe that's what most people are thinking about here, but you gotta get there. Like against Cleveland, I could see Pat Bev alongside Dame. And I could see more offense defense in that situation, especially if those are close games. But I think Malik's done enough this year, and he's bought in enough, and he's really worked hard to be a good team defender, to be a good individual defender. So my gut is to say yes. But I do think Doc's not just gonna sort of like grandfather him in a series if it is a bad matchup. I am thinking Cleveland specifically with that really kind of a smaller, quicker backcourt. So excellent question. I don't know if they know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, no, I like where your head is at as far as a yes, but, or like it depends, right? Like that's the NBA playoffs is. We know the Bucks are going to be Dame, Middleton, Giannis, and the other two are going to depend. Like the Heat running around screens. That's not Jay Crowder's forte. You're not going to want Jay Crowder in a game like that. Beasley, maybe, probably, but like really, I like where your head is at as far as like it depends on those matchups. That those really dictate, especially for those role players, like who is going to play significant minutes and who's going to really have that positive impact, because it can vary. Like we saw in the Bucks championship run, Bobby Portis sit out the entire net series, but then also play huge minutes in other games and other series, because that net series was not a good one for him. Defensively, I think is where my biggest question marks come for Beasley of like, I still wouldn't peg him as a great defender. His effort has been tremendous this year. And I've been a big proponent of defense is not just effort. It's not like a light switch you can turn on and off. That's a factor to it, but it's not like you can just decide to be a good shooter. Like, oh, I'm going to try hard at shooting. Now I'm going to be a good shooter. Defense, in my opinion, is the same of like, yes, for some of these athletes, it's that way of like, all right, are you engaged or not? But for the most part, it's, do you have the athletic capabilities to stick with it? I think that'll be a big question mark for Beasley, especially because they switch a lot of screens with him and Lillard. So like him and Lillard, like size players, switch a lot of those on ball actions. So that'll be interesting for me to watch is how does Beasley hold up? He'll start as that primary defender, but how will he finish in games? I don't know if you have any insight into his growth this season as a defender, as the Bucks' primary defender.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you on the broad stretch of it isn't just effort and try hard. But I will say this with Malik, and he even said this to me way back when I sat with him when he signed here. I don't know, like I think the try hard factor for him on a 38-minute basis, it has been kind of a big deal. I think we've seen him look okay. I don't know. Look, I'm not gonna. Individual defensive rating is a totally flawed metric, but it is a metric that exists, right? And he's of the guys who play. It's Brooke, AJ Green, and Malik Beasley. 1, 2, 3. And so. And I guess where I'm going with that is I think Doc has helped Malik, know more what he needs to do, but it's also where to direct that effort, Brian. So I think it's that mix that you're talking about, where Doc has helped everybody with that. But I think in the backcourt specifically, I think Dame and Malik have been better together since Rivers came over. Now, look, it's the regular season. There have definitely been days where they have not gotten up into a screen, right? And Brooke is the one that's sort of left there as these guys are coming around and sort of unfettered. But we've also seen those games where those guys fight over that stuff, right? So I do think he's a little better, I guess, than maybe I'm sure what we'll hear nationally. But yeah, I still do think there's probably an element of that matchup based stuff. The other thing I'm curious about, again, we haven't seen it, depending on that matchup, like against Boston, for instance, I could see Chris moving up to that sort of shooting guard spot, right? And then you have Jay, where Chris doesn't have that lateral quickness anymore as much, but depending who it is. I mean, Chris is usually the one chasing around Duncan Robinson. You know what I mean? So like so I think we're going to see some of that stuff. But yeah, I think Beasley, honestly, Brian, he's going to get that shot because I think he's earned that in Doc's eyes, and they're just keeping on him. And I think Bees is really sort of bought in, and he said this the other night, actually, in New Orleans. He felt he didn't do enough in LA last year to have a run, to be part of that group that went to a Western Conference final. He lost his spot, basically. He's kind of got a chip on his shoulder about that, Brian. So I think, they're going to give him a chance to like play with that, and the team defensive part of it with Giannis and Brooke now behind him, I think is just giving him that much more confidence to sort of, be a little better, if you will, on that side.
Yeah. I agree with you. Everything you said about Middleton and Boston, all of that. And the last thing I'll say about Beasley is just ball screen management. I think that is hard. It's easy to do a time or two. It's hard to maintain that consistently. Like getting skinny, like this is what Doc Rivers wants, is he wants Beasley to get up on those ball handlers, get skinny around the screens and be able to slide through them. That's easy to do once or twice. Can you maintain that for 30, 35, 38, whatever minutes? That is the question. That's hard to do. That takes a physical toll on your body. Is all right, you can get through one, but can you get through the second screen? Can you get through the third screen on one possession? Like, do you have the energy and effort level to maintain that and then do that in a 7-game series? Like that, I think, is a question. And I agree with you too. Like Beasley, he wants to prove, like he right now is on a 1-year low salary deal. He wants to make that money. Is like whatever that sounds, that's just realistic. He has a lot of money on the line, a lot of personal pride on the line, that he can really set himself up well for the rest of his career with a great postseason run.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's to me why he's sort of an X factor on that broader level for me, Brian, because those are the unanswered questions that we just won't know on both sides of the court until we get there.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So my first X factor is Jay Crowder. I think that his role with the Bucks is versatile. It can be multiple depending on where he's at and what the opponent is. You touched on this a lot, actually, in that first conversation of it really depends. And I think Crowder can be sort of like a chameleon. He can play multiple roles. He's not one who's suited to chase Duncan Robinson around the 3-point line. That was part of the issue, like in their last game against the Miami Heat, but he can be a great matchup against bigger wings and smaller forwards. That's more of his forte this year, as far as just bringing that physicality. The Bucks, I think, under Doc Rivers especially, really know what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses. They know they're not a quick team. They want to put their hands on defenses. And I love how Rivers is just open about that in his post game, like in his media, like answers of they want to put their hands on players, because there's a legal way to do that, especially in the NBA, of like they want Crowder to get his hands on defenders, other guys, because that's the only way they can keep people in front of them. And so I think Crowder can play a lot of different roles in that area. He can play the small 4 next to Giannis if Doc wants to go that way. I don't know if he wants to do that, but if he chooses to do that, he can. But we've also seen that Jay Crowder can play with Giannis and Bobby Portis, or Giannis and Brook Lopez in the front court, and even with Middleton alongside him, he can play in those big lineups. So I think for me, Crowder is one of those X factors. Is can he bring that defensive intensity that helps the Bucks? Because it's him and Pat Bev who bring that defensive intensity for Milwaukee. I don't know how playable Pat Bev will be every single game. Can Crowder help fill some of that role? And the answer to me, or if he can do that, is can he knock down enough shots? Can he knock down enough 3-point shots? I've seen a little bit more cutting from him in the last month or so. He's also making 40% of his threes in the month of March. Obviously that helps. Like if you can space the floor, that's great. But if he can't knock down those shots in the postseason, nobody's going to pay any attention to him. Like whoever his man is going to be sitting in the paint, clogging it for Giannis, for Brook, for Dame, for Middleton, for everyone. So that's really my X factor is, number one, can he make enough shots on offense to make his defense worth it? But then also that versatility and lineup versatility that he brings for Milwaukee.
Yeah, I think to stretch that out even further, Brian. No, it is like you did the whole month of March, but the last 10 games, he's shooting like 45% from three. He went through a rough stretch coming back from the injury, right? And unlike PJ Tucker in that championship, who just, I mean, at least he still shot it once a game back then, as opposed to like Jay's going to put it up. You have him out there, he's going to shoot it, which I think will help, even if it gets his guy to move just a little bit, right? But he knows what he's here for, and he said it took a while post-op. He had never had a major surgery before. He had never had that injury before. He had never had a rehab like that, which is quite remarkable, but it speaks to sort of the mental part of that. And, he, not that he's just over it now, but it took a little while for him to feel like totally good defensively. And I think we've seen him move better, right? And I think the fact that, when Chris is back, and clearly they're going to push him to 38, 40 minutes, whatever it may be. So if Jay's playing, spot minutes or, a tighter rotation and those legs are that much fresher, Brian, like you're right. I think you're going to see probably the better version of Jay as a Buck, right, than we have, because he'll kind of be able to use all those fouls in a shorter amount of time and be the kind of that physical player. But you're right. It's they're going to need him for that. And even though he's a veteran who's been to a finals and been to a bunch of conference finals, and he's sort of got his playoff track record, he's a little older. And we haven't seen it yet in a couple years, right? Probably since 2021.
Yeah.
That's a while ago. So no, I agree with you. I think he'll shoot the three well enough. He's not going to be a black hole over there. I think you're right. It is the defensive side to see how Doc uses him and when and against whom.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about that is too, I think it's kind of the offset of a question that I ask myself is, are there enough minutes for Crowder and Pat Connaughton in the same playoff lineup? And I've been down on Pat Connaughton for the last 2 years. He had great playoff run. Even he was horrible all of last regular season, but then all of a sudden the 5 games against the Heat, great, tremendous. But he's also a Budenholzer guy. Like, will that same weight carry with Doc Rivers? We've seen it actually carry in the regular season, but in the postseason when that rotation starts to get cut down, are there enough room for both of those guys? And Connaughton, he's been playing more of a on-ball role with Milwaukee, as that in that Giannis and bench lineups, it's been Giannis, and then Connaughton's kind of been playing the de facto point guard. I don't know how I feel about that, but that's kind of besides this point. But I think my question is, if it's Crowder and Connaughton, are there enough room, or is there enough room in that rotation for both of them, especially if only one of them is playing well? And that's where I would give the nod to Crowder, because he's better defensively and has been a little bit more versatile as far as who he can guard on defense.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Jay is shooting the three better than Pat, in the last month. Yeah, Pat's a Bud guy, but Doc has immediately fallen in love. He has professed his love for Pat Connaughton as well. We've seen that. I think Pat's getting a handful of more minutes per game than Jay. Obviously, Jay started a bunch with the injuries to Chris. It's a good question. And I feel like other than that, the championship run where Bud, I think, was a bit more flexible in who he played and when, I think that could really depend series to series with Doc. I don't think he's beholden to anybody other than, his starting five. And I do believe he thinks Bobby needs to play a lot. Obviously, he's their only other big to give Brooke and Giannis rest. He loves having the two bigs on the court most of the time. So, but after Bobby, I could see it really depending there. And again, playoffs, you sort of probably lean defense when you've got the big three going. You don't need the other playmaker. You maybe don't need the shooting, if you will. So, it's a good question. But again, with Doc, the first run with him, a lot of interesting unanswered questions in that regard.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Hopefully we get a deep playoff run where we get to see exactly how he likes to play it out. All right. So I've gone through one X factor. You've gone through one X factor. Who's your second X factor?
So this sort of, goes right into this. And again, thinking in the context of that championship season, and, I'm going to bring up, the guy who got an A on the group project in Jeff Teague. And the reason I bring him up is because, look, they needed him for 2 games, right? And he hit some shots. And look, Giannis didn't play. Chris Middleton would have won the conference finals MVP if they invented it a year earlier. But look, AJ Green, Brian, is the guy, right? He's the young guy that Doc Rivers came and anointed is the one that's going to play for him. And I think, look, AJ, he plays about 13 minutes a game when he plays, that he's missed a handful of games, didn't get off the bench. There's games like New Orleans where Doc says, probably should have played him instead of Pat Bev, against Pelican zone. He's played 13 minutes down to 5, right? But he's there to shoot. So if AJ Green comes in and goes 3 for 5, that could win a game. Mm-hmm. And look, if they go zone, Doc's run more zone, talking to some other writers around the league, than he has in most other places. I think he likes AJ in the zone. 6'4", 200 pounds. He's a little bigger than maybe he looks or people think he is. So he's a good fit out in the backcourt. In that way, he slides his feet. He's not a total liability. And he knows this, he jokes. He's like, yeah, people are going to come at me. And you see him hold up. And I just think when you, again, mentioning X factors, AJ Green might be a guy who wins you a game. And look, when you need to win 16, 1 is no small thing. So the fact that Doc kind of picks and chooses when AJ plays, you mentioned the second unit with Giannis, with Pat Connaughton. AJ's kind of been that guy at times in that second quarter, maybe late, if Doc feels like they need a shooting threat, and he's not afraid to put it up. His teammates aren't afraid to give it to him. And, he's an instant heater off the bench, Brian. It's quite remarkable. And so, I'm going to go with him just because, again, could be one game, but that could be all you need to make that run and win another title.
Yeah, the way that he stays ready, like it's so hard to be a shooter and stay on the bench till what? Even on his good games, he gets in middle of second quarter and just first seconds he's on the court, he's ready to shoot and fire, like with that high release way up there. Actually, I had to put my pencil down for this too, because you mentioned his defense. Like the way that he shows his hands on defense is remarkable. Like that's what refs want to see is you're bodying up, you're putting your chest right into ball handlers, and he always has his hands up here. Like he could probably actually get him a little down, especially in the NBA, but it's just great. Like that's great fundamentals. He slides his feet, puts his hands up here. Question, who's a better defender right now today, AJ Green or Pat Connaughton when it comes to on ball?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, that's a good question. I'll lean with Pat, and here's why. Pat's going to be able to get away with, you mentioned the hands coming. Pat's going to be able to get away with a little more, I think.
Yeah.
And does that make him a better defender? Yeah, because I think AJ Green gets called for those fouls.
Yeah.
Pat doesn't. And I do think Pat, probably his experience, team defensive wise, all that stuff, probably I'm going to give him that little bit of an edge. But AJ, I think learned from, he hasn't told me this, but I think he's a smart dude. I think he saw Andre get rung up for all those fouls because he was so handsy. And AJ just, and Marjan, I remember this early in the year, Brian, you'd see Marjan, his feet would kind of cross a little bit, rather than like a clean slide, right? And so Marjan's hips would get turned. AJ just is never really out of like position when an official's looking at him. And I think the hands are up because he's AJ Green. And he knows like they're going to call me for something, right? So, but yeah, so I'm going to give it to Pat for all those sort of like intricate reasons. But I think AJ, it's not just the shooting. I think Doc does trust him in some of those spots that he's going to play good defense and not get called for some of the kind of the ticky-tack stuff that maybe another second year, 10-minute a guy player would get called for.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say Pat Connaughton's a better team defender. He's a better off-ball defender. I think AJ Green's a better on-ball defender this year because I think Pat Connaughton has lost a step or two on ball, but he still has a little bit of that explosiveness. But yeah, AJ Green, I think like you said, his ability to not come in whenever he could come in the third quarter, be ready to shoot right away. He'd get 3 shots up in 3 possessions if the opportunity presented itself. So I think that he will have a chance if Doc Rivers plays him. That'll be the biggest question because since Rivers took over, he said, one of these young guys are really going to have to play a role. They're going to have to come in and impact the game. But then we haven't seen Andre Jackson Jr. since Rivers took over. We haven't seen Beauchamp since before Rivers took over. It's really been AJ Green who's emerged out of all 3 of those guys, which I think is interesting, especially with Andre Jackson Jr. He was drafted under a certain vision of Adrian Griffin's. Like that was really the changing of the guard. If Budenholzer was a coach during this last draft, he never would have been drafted, right? Budenholzer loves those floor spacers. AJ Green, right? Like that's why they signed him as an undrafted free agent. So that's really interesting to me to see those 3, how that has worked out for this season. But yeah, I think if Rivers is willing to give Green a chance in the playoffs, I agree. Like he'll have a great chance to come in and impact a game because he can be okay in defense, but it'll be, like you said, 3 for 5 from behind the arc, can quickly change a game in those 10, 12 minutes or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was thinking for X Factor, this conversation, Brian. And again, real quick, I just want to mention this. I thought this is a credit to AJ playing more. I was curious if his 3-point percentage would go down a little bit. I give the guy credit. Almost 41%, since Doc came in and he's played more. Because you know what I mean? Like small sample size, people can kind of get caught up in that stuff. And yes, technically that's still a small sample size, but I think that fact alone, Brian, again, it may just be a game in a series after he sits one series. So to me, well, it'll be interesting to see if he gets that opportunity and he might do something big.
Well, and it's not just about, for me, it's not just about his 3-point percentage. It's the gravity, like if he's replacing a Pat Connaughton or Jay Crowder, when those guys are in the corners, because that's mostly their role, right? Being in the corners. When those guys are in the corners, their defenders seem to like drift a little bit more toward the paint. They can't do that with Green. Like they stick closer to him, which then opens up his teammates for a lot of that other action too. So it can be kind of that snowball effect for Green, but also for Lillard, for Giannis, for Brook, for whoever else he's sharing the court with.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. His range is, he hit the one logo. Ooh. That might be a little deep for him. I don't know if he can do it, pull a nose in the playoffs. But you're right. It is how quickly that scouting report is. And, in a playoff series, he's on the scouting report. And they'll be telling, his defender, you cannot go that far away because they will give it to him and he will pull it.
Oh yeah.
So that in and of itself, you're right. His mere presence, and it's so funny to say that about AJ Green, right? But if all you're asking about is just an impact of some kind in a short amount of window to give somebody a breather, that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Yep, exactly. All right, so for my second X factor, I cheated. I went the opposite direction of Damian Lillard is who is my X factor, and not for like his overall game, but just because I was diving into it, trying to figure out, I think he's a lot more volatile than a Giannis. Giannis gets most of his shots at the rim. He's probably, I'm not even going to say probably, he's the most consistent player in the NBA as far as his nightly output is. You know what you can get from him every single night. It's going to be there. It's how do you fill in the rest of the points. Damian Lillard, especially this season with Milwaukee, I've talked about on this podcast, all of the personal stuff that he's had going on. Like there's a lot of reasons. And I don't want to dive into all of the reasons, just, what's going on the court. But I was looking it up today. So in wins, he averages 26.3 points while shooting 46% from the field, 39% from the 3-point line, and 94% from the free throw line. In losses, it's 20.3 points, so 6 fewer points, 37%, 29% from the 3-point line, and 88%. So that's a pretty big dip. And he actually averages 1 extra field goal attempt per game in those losses, and he does win. So for me, that's why I named him as the X factor is, can he get hot, or not even hot? Like, can he just be status quo or hit his Damian Lillard averages enough times in a series, knowing that Giannis is going to put up his? Can Dame get his enough times? And based on so far, he hits his 26 points 4 out of every 6 games, which is perfect. Like in a 7-game series, if you're doing that, that means the Bucks are probably going to win more times than they're going to lose. But that's why I named him, cheated a little bit, just because I felt like those win-loss splits were pretty extreme as far as we see those really low games from Lillard, just like we see those really high games from him. And they seem to really correlate with wins and losses. Obviously, every star player their wins and losses, or their stats are going to correlate with that, right? Like Giannis, his down games, obviously the Bucks aren't going to win as often. But I just felt like it was more extreme with Lillard. So that's why I named that, as far as, can he get it going, and his comfort level too. Can he not just create shots for himself, but can he create shots for the rest of his teammates? It really comes down to, I think, one of his most underrated skills is his basketball IQ, his ability to dissect the game, create shots for himself, but also create those good looks for his teammates. So can he do that 4 out of 7 times? Or if he falls short, can Milwaukee pick him up? So that I just named him as my second and final X factor.
Yeah, a little bit of a tease. I mean, going a few weeks from now, during the bye week, and sort of the reasons why the Bucks will win a championship this year is Dame, the guy that they got for this. And so I definitely agree with you that his performance, whatever that may be, in a protracted run, I mean, that's, we don't know. His career playoff numbers in Portland, all very, very good. But obviously we know he was in a different situation then, right? And so this is all new in so many ways. And, particularly of late, Brian, right, where, there's been such an emphasis from Doc to refine that 2-man game, actually run the 2-man game, and it has looked better, right? You still might get the funky lob, that's quite might be mistimed, but then, they'll get one that same game. But to your point, the playmaking, I think, has looked good. Going back to, we started this with Beasley, when Giannis and Dame are zipping the ball around, I think it does help both of them, and I think it probably helps Damian a little more, especially since the refs have sort of changed the way they're officiating. He's averaging a full 3 free throws less per game after the All-Star break, which is insane, right? Yeah. So if that's sort of being taken away from him, Not that he's not going to keep going to the basket, but he's going to have to do some other things, which is make shots. And no, I agree with you. I think, we don't know what this version of playoff Damian Lillard is going to look like. And I think that fits what kind of an X factor is. Because honestly, look, we know what Giannis and Chris and Brooke and Bobby Portis and whatever the critiques are, Pat Connaughton. We've watched them win a championship and go through that run. We've watched that core go to an Eastern Conference Finals, even, right? We've seen a hurt Chris Middleton and Giannis. Obviously they disappointing loss against the Heat. They were injured, but they still were able to do pretty amazing things under the circumstance. Giannis in that Boston series a couple years ago was probably one of the greatest individual series I've ever seen.
Yeah,
that no one will remember. So we kind of know that. What we don't know is the Dame, is the Dame factor, if you will. And I think you're kind of right on. It's not a cheat totally to call him an X factor, what he does and how he does it over a protracted playoff run.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how Giannis, Middleton, and Lillard split up the time, because I think Giannis, he goes hard all the time, right? And that actually, is good, and it leaves him a little bit more fatigued for the end of the game, where Lillard is more of kind of an assassin as far as he's reading the defenses, not trying to score necessarily in quarters 1 through 3, but trying to figure out how can he best thrive in that fourth quarter. So I think that fits well. Like, let Giannis annihilate teams, and Middleton too. Like, Middleton, I think, needs to pick it up a little bit there, but that'll be interesting to see. Can they get that rhythm going where it's all right, Giannis, Middleton, or whoever, you really thrive quarters 1 through 3 or minutes 1 through 40, and then let Lillard take over that final 6, and however that works. But yeah, that'll be really interesting to see. Can they finally, or can they consistently pick that up? Because we've seen that from them at times this year for sure. It's just, can they do it repeatedly? I mean, against the Thunder, they were diabolical, even with Middleton and Lillard struggling mightily. Like, the rest of their team picked up the slack. Can they do that consistently? That'll be, I think, for me, the biggest question. And especially when it comes to Lillard, is he's had the biggest adjustment. Giannis still has a ball in his hands a ton, is going to get his. Lillard has his ball, has the hand in his ball. Has the ball in his hands a ton, but not relatively speaking to his Portland career, right? I mean, I think I was looking up today. I think he still ranks 27th in usage percentage, which seems high, but is low for him. So that's still like something that he's trying to figure out, and we'll see. I mean, time's running out, but I think that they've been playing the long game, and Rivers continues to talk about that in post-game press conferences, right? Of like, all right, we didn't do this well tonight, but we'll learn from it and we'll grow. It's not about winning these games in March. It's about setting themselves up for April, May, and June.
Yeah, and I think for sure. And again, we've seen the two-man action with Giannis improve. It is better, without a doubt. And Chris, they need to figure it out, but I feel like whatever three-man stuff they do, I mean, there was one just the other night where, they started it, and Dame literally ran into Giannis right at the top of the three-point line and lost the ball, and they had to start it over again. But so that will take a little bit of time, but I do think because it's Chris and he's a different kind of playmaker, that might click a little easier. What I'm curious about, Brian, is Dame's, he's played 40 minutes a game in playoffs before. Maybe he hasn't had the same defensive responsibility before. And that's going to be interesting too, is if you think about the Knicks or Cleveland, and depending on which ball handlers are out there for Boston, he's going to have to get beat up a little bit on the defensive end, and he's going to have to do some stuff. And how does that affect his legs for the fourth quarter? And does he not? And I will say this, Brian, like Beasley, how we started this conversation, Dame's got a chip on his shoulder with this. He is not really appreciated the national discourse around his defense. And look, man, I've been around enough of these guys. He's a walking Hall of Famer. He's a top 75. There's so few of those types of people that when they just kind of get that little extra, that's a little extra a lot of people don't have. And so I am really interested to see how all that comes together for him and on the defensive end. And then also to your point of, all right, I'm going to work a little harder with this and maybe ease off on offense because Giannis is going to, smash some dudes and Chris is going to do his thing. Fourth quarter, I'm scoring 16.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really interested in seeing as well.
Yeah. And I'll say I'm guilty. I called him out I'm sure he does not listen to this podcast. And I'm just in my film room, right? Like I've called him out for not being a good defensive player, but it doesn't matter what I say. Like in the playoffs, teams are going to come after him every single game, every single night. So at the end of the day, the proof is going to be in the pudding. Are you going to put it on film and are you going to be a defender or are you going to because I can just think of a Celtics matchup right now. There's nowhere to hide. You can't hide against the Celtics. You can hide against the Heat. You can hide against the Knicks. You can hide against some of these other teams. But if you make it that far where you play Boston, there's nowhere to hide. They're going to find him and they're going to come after him and it's going to be relentless. So it doesn't matter what I say in my little podcast or on my little Twitter or X or whatever it's called. Like he's going to have to put it out there, which we've seen from him in moments for sure. 100%. Like he's had great moments like the other week where he had that big steal, but can he do that consistently? Because that's what championship teams do is it's not just last 2 or 3 possessions, but it's, can you do that consistently? I feel like I'm being harsh on him as I'm saying it, but I just want, I think he can do it. It's because especially offensively, his load will be lighter than in Portland, right? Like he can take a few more possessions off with Giannis there, with Middleton there, and focus a little bit more of the energy on defense. But ultimately at the end of the day, like what he puts on film on defense is going to be out there because teams are going to come after him, especially in the postseason. I'm excited to see. I'm excited. I think the Bucks have a lot of potential. I think he's ready to live up to that hype. Like you said, that chip on his shoulder is there and he has a lot extra to give. And so I'm excited to see that. So Jim, I appreciate you hopping on the podcast. We're running 47 minutes. I promised you 30 minutes. So I don't want to take up any more of your time. Jim, any last words or insights as far as X factors for the Bucks postseason run?
No, I appreciate you inviting me, Brian. It's definitely respect what you do and appreciate you putting that out there for Bucks fans. So thanks for having me. But yeah, in terms of the Bucks, honest, we get into it. Doc Rivers, curious to see. He's kind of been there, done that in a lot of playoff series. I like what I've seen to date with what he's done. The way he's changed things and done some things game to game. Look, right, that was one of the big selling points of an Adrian Griffin change from Mike Budenholzer, right? Curious to see how that plays out in the postseason because this is all kind of new. And so I would say, if a coach can be an X factor, they made that move for a reason, Brian. So I think that'll be the other one that will have a big spotlight on it, especially on the national perspective, when the Bucks playoff run begins.
Yeah, I feel a lot better about where they're at under Doc Rivers. I think that they're, even if their record isn't as good as it was, their process is a lot better. And that's what we talked about a lot of times under Adrian Griffin was just process wasn't there. It looks a lot better now. I agree with you. Doc Rivers, I think the team's trending in the right direction. I feel a lot more hopeful and I'm optimistic about what this postseason will bring and what their potential is.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be good. If they're healthy, Brian, it could be another run, a deep run for sure.
Hopefully they're healthy for the first time since they won it, really.
Yeah, and even when they won it, if you think about it, they lost the starting guard in the first round and their MVP in the Eastern Conference Finals for 2 games. So, it's really since 18-19, Brian, I think they haven't had a full their rotation last a whole series, let alone a run, a series. So,
right.
Or at least 2 series. So yeah, that'll be that aside, the rest of this, it should be really interesting and a fun watch.
Yeah. All right. I'm more amped up now. I'm ready for the playoffs. They start in 3 weeks for the Bucks after the play-in tournament. So thank you again, Jim. I appreciate it. Thank you for the listeners. You can subscribe on YouTube, follow along on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, hit that subscribe button, whatever you want to do. I really appreciate y'all. I'll catch you next time.